All right. A little bit here of my updating or what? It's taking like 4 times as long to open stuff. But we have it all up now, so that's good. Um, I hope you guys don't mind that I'm sitting. I managed to go for a tip in my parking lot yesterday, and so I'm a little bit sore. I made it almost a whole week into the winter before I fell, but yeah, at least I didn't hurt myself badly. I'm just very stiff. So I'm like, I'm gonna sit if I can. But today we're going to be wrapping, or I guess we're starting the sort of last of our 2 chapters, and they're going to be looking at psychological disorders. And I think the next one is sort of dealing with psychological disorders, but I'm now questioning myself. That might be a different class, but at least this one is psychological disorders. And so our textbook does a pretty neat job sort of giving us the stats, the breakdown of the fact that psychological disorders are prevalent. They're something that affect a lot of people. And there are estimates as large as 1 out of every 5 in the US are going to be diagnosed with a mental illness. And maybe as high as almost 50%. I think they go as high as like 46% of individuals will have a diagnosable mental illness in their lifetime. But there's a lot of issues with these kinds of statistics, and we've kind of thought about these before when we've looked at methods of psychology, where a lot of these statistics will be coming from self-reports. So individuals would report their own symptoms. And a lot of these types of reports are notoriously inaccurate. So it's probably an overestimate, but we're not quite sure. So when we get these kinds of statistics, we typically want to keep in mind the fact that it's coming from that source. So plus or minus a couple of degrees, I guess. But despite that, even if we're overestimating, even if we're, say, doubling the rates, that's still a massive amount of people affected by different kinds of psychological disorders. And if we think about sort of the costs, both personal and societal, mental disorders end up costing society quite a lot. And it's one of the leading causes of disability in North America. And again, with a lot of this, we're going to keep in mind that our textbook and most psychology classes are going to be very North American centric in North America. So for example, on the next slide, when we start talking about the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, specifically the DSM-5, because it's the 5th edition, that's the most recent, that's what we're using now. This is what's used in North America, but in Europe, they have different preferences. And I can never keep track of which their standard is at any given time, because some of my textbooks are a little bit older than others, and I don't remember which one comes first. But we mostly care about the DSM-5. And so this is just providing us a framework for therapists and clinicians and researchers to try and assess an individual's unique history and their symptoms in order to provide them with a diagnosis. And so within this diagnostic manual, they're going to have sort of all sorts of possible disorders, and they're going to be able to sort of piece apart which symptoms fit for this particular individual, which of these disorders do they best relate to. And many of these disorders, a lot of the stuff that comes up in the DSM-5, we've ended up focusing on them in prior chapters. So we've done a pretty good job of touching on little bits and pieces of these disorders as we cover relevant topics. So we talked about substance-related disorders in Chapter 5 and eating disorders in Chapter 6. So we have sort of a little bit of a framework there, and we're not going to go into those already discussed disorders because we already did that. So for this chapter, we're going to be focusing more on what's left over. And for the most part, we're going to be focusing in on schizophrenia, which will be today. We're also going to talk about affective disorders and anxiety disorders, at least some anxiety disorders, and that'll be on Thursday. But just so that you know, this isn't going to be a complete list. Usually when I do a overview of psychological disorders, usually for an intro course, it's a much larger list. but with a lot less detail per topic. So because we've integrated all of this, we get to spend a little bit more time on each of these. And as we get into our discussion today on schizophrenia, I'm actually going to let you know that some of the slides are actually from a different textbook. Just because like I've said before, I teach a genetics and behavior course, and we spend weeks in that class talking about schizophrenia. And so I thought it was interesting, instead of the textbook where they sort of mention in passing different kinds of studies and the fact that they show this thing, I could actually show you some of those studies. So I'll give you the heads up that there's more detail on those slides than you need. And the formatting of those ones is just a little bit different because I stole them from another class. But I'll point those out as we get there. All right, so that's a pretty long preamble. But okay, so we've covered the DSM-5 and what we're going to be expecting. Two really important terms that we're going to be talking about and sort of dropping throughout this chapter are incidence and prevalence. And these are sort of two different measures or concepts for understanding the widespreadness of different disorders. So incidence is reporting the number of individuals that develop a condition across a specific amount of time. Usually it's going to be the number of people across a year. Sometimes you'll see it like a lifetime incidence, but they'll usually specify that it's an abnormal report. And sometimes we'll also see prevalence, which is a total count or a percentage of people who have a particular condition at a specific point in time. So instead of saying, okay, this many people are diagnosed with that we have an incidence, prevalence is how many people are currently existing that have this diagnosis. So it's looking at a cross-section of the population at a given point in time and pointing out how many people have that particular diagnosis. And both of these can be really, really useful when you're trying to study these different disorders, because incidence is telling us how many new cases are arriving, and prevalence is telling us how many exist in the population at a time. So both can be very useful. And it's important to keep in mind that while individuals can be diagnosed with a particular disorder, those diagnoses may change or shift or be dropped as time goes on. It isn't super likely to quote unquote grow out of a psychological disorder, but it is possible. And we also want to keep in mind some of the limitations of these diagnoses. So using the DSM-5, we're sort of restricted to what they list as psychological disorders. So we can only be diagnosed with what they have put forward. And we found some issues. If you've taken psychology courses before, you might have talked about this, but between editions, the DSM between say 4 and 5 or 3 and 4 will make massive overhauls to the structure of their diagnostic criteria. And there are some things that are classified as disorders that are then no longer classified as disorders. There's a lot of controversy tied up in there. For example, up until surprisingly recently, I believe homosexuality was classified as a psychological disorder. I think that was only the DSM-3. So there's a lot of things that change, and there's a lot of contention around that. So just keep in mind that the system with which diagnoses are assigned is its own problematic affair. All right. And all of that, I was just trying to explain incidence and prevalence, but all that other information is important too. And so again, our textbook does this really nice job of giving us some nice summary slides or summary tables where they sort of give us the Coles Notes version of each of these major disorders. And so we're going to be looking at some of the high points of these. So like I said, today will be schizophrenia. On Thursday, we're going to be looking at affective disorders. And so we're going to go into more detail today and then cover more topics on Thursday, but it'll balance out pretty nicely. So this is just a nice roadmap and maybe a little bit of a reference for you guys. All right, so we get to talk about schizophrenia today, as I said, and this is a debilitating disorder that is typically characterized by perceptual, emotional, and intellectual deficits that can include loss of contact with reality and an inability to function in everyday life. So this is, by most accounts, the most severe and disruptive of mental illnesses because it affects not only the individual who's experiencing it, but also their family, their friends, their surroundings. And this is an interesting one because all social classes are equally vulnerable to schizophrenia. And I believe we're going to talk a little bit about sex differences later on, but it's something that seems to be pretty widespread with not a lot of patterns of this particular group or this particular type are more susceptible to it, which is fairly interesting. We do see some interesting interactions, and we'll start talking about things like a diathesis stress model or a vulnerability model, where as people are exposed to more stressors, they're more likely to express these disorders. And for that reason, we sometimes see that it's more strongly expressed in individuals with lower socioeconomic status, simply because they experience more stressors and therefore have a higher likelihood of expressing the disorder. But things like genetic predisposition isn't limited to sort of one category or another. All right. And the text goes into a lot of factual details, like the fact that there's a prevalence of about 0.4% of the global population has schizophrenia, a little bit higher in the US because, of course, US and North America centric. I don't really care too much for those types of statistics, but we can consider the fact that, again, like most psychological disorders, schizophrenia is going to be something that is costly to the individual and to society in terms of sort of mental taxation, but also taxing the system to maintain or to take care of them and maintain them. And there's this very interesting situation going on right now where we're seeing a decline in most countries in the world. So rates of schizophrenia are falling. And there's a lot of debate as to what's going on. So on the surface, it might just be that fewer people are developing schizophrenia. But it seems to be more of a methodological issue where maybe people were, say, erroneously assigned as schizophrenic previously and are now no longer, or inconsistencies in diagnostics. And so as sort of more strict policies come forward, as we sort of evolve our DSM, it's getting harder and harder to get that specific classification. There's a lot of debate there. So it's one of those things where if you just looked at the numbers, it looks like rates of schizophrenia are dropping globally, but it's probably more complicated than that. And so I guess for more of the actual experiences, the symptoms, the characteristics of schizophrenia, we can categorize it as a psychosis. Basically, we're saying that an individual is going to have severe disturbances of their reality, their orientation, and their thinking. So it's going to change a lot about how they view their world, how they interact with their world, and how they interact with others as well. Yep. Yeah, and that's one of the big things, especially advancing to the DSM-5. There was a big change in like bipolar disorder is no longer bipolar disorder. They've called it something else. And they've managed to sort of subset it away from other things because there was this whole clump of different psychoses that all kind of overlapped, and there was a lot of mislabeling in between them. And so they tried to fix some of their criteria. But a lot of the problem is that, again, the DSM-5 and other manuals like that, you're trying to fit people into a category, and it's not necessarily going to work well. And as we're going to start seeing, a lot of these things exist more on a spectrum or a continuum, and a lot of them are comorbid, so they happen at the same time. And so it's a lot less clean cut. So diagnosis is putting people in boxes, but it's not necessarily an accurate way to do it. So I think it's, something to do with diagnostic error and maybe shifting in how things are being adjusted now. And it's different between countries too, which is really frustrating because we use the DSM-5, other places use other things, and none of them agree. So it's a really interesting time to try and figure out what's going on. So for our brief history of schizophrenia, the term itself was coined by a Swiss psychiatrist in 1911, Eugen Bleuler. There's too many L's in there for this time of day. But he was just using a combination of Greek words to mean split and mind. And this was originally associated with the concept of sort of multiple personalities, but instead the term is actually referring to sort of a split from reality, where their thoughts and emotions are separated from what they're actually experiencing. So it's not so much a split mind like the movie Split, but more of a detachment and a distortion of what they're actually experiencing. And we're going to start seeing, as we delve into this, that the blanket term of schizophrenia is actually kind of misleading. Again, that idea of trying to fit people into boxes in order to diagnose them. Schizophrenia can be classified and chopped up a bunch of different ways. And we see combinations of lots of symptoms, and some of the symptoms are contradictory. So you can have people who are both diagnosed as schizophrenic, but have almost no overlap in their symptoms. So we can see things like hallucinations and delusions. So seeing things that aren't there, thinking things are happening when they're really not. That can kind of tie into paranoia. We see disorganized thought and social withdrawal. It's very difficult to sort of keep a straight train of thought, and it's hard to interact with society. That's part of why it's very difficult for individuals with schizophrenia to function in normal society. And we might see inappropriate emotions or lack of emotion. So maybe they're going to find really sad events very funny, or maybe they're not going to react to things at all, even though they probably should. And so we start seeing that even from this short list of symptoms, these are very, very diverse symptoms. And we're going to look at ways that we can kind of describe different categories of symptoms, and even how the diagnosis of schizophrenia has shifted over time. All right. And so when I first started teaching my genetics and behavior course, I was teaching about sort of some of the different subcategories of schizophrenia. And they had sort of divided individuals up into, they had sort of special categories, so catatonic schizophrenia and affective schizophrenia and all of these different ones. But with the recent changes to the diagnostic material, we're sort of changing that up a little bit. So a modern understanding of schizophrenia is basically acknowledging the fact that it's a very diverse disorder, and any kind of split, any kind of separation into different categories of schizophrenia isn't necessarily going to be beneficial. So like I said before, we can have individuals who have the exact same symptoms that come from completely different causes, might be driven by different brain areas, different imbalances, different things missing, but the exact same appearance. So their phenotype's the same, but the thing driving it is different. Or we might have people who have the exact same brain deficit. So if we look at their brain scans, if we measure their different neurotransmitter levels, everything is the same, but their symptoms are completely different. And that kind of speaks to the fact that we don't really know a whole heck of a lot about this disorder. So we accept the fact that, yeah, causes can vary, and so can the symptoms. And it's not necessarily going to be in a predictable manner like we might like. So we can talk about symptoms being acute versus chronic. Acute symptoms are ones that develop very suddenly and are typically more responsive to treatment. So in these situations, individuals are going to have sort of sudden onset of symptoms of schizophrenia. And then if they are treated for it, those symptoms might go away. So their prognosis is reasonably good. And here prognosis being ability to function normally, however we define normal. But they are sort of prone to brief relapses. But as long as they stick with their treatment regimen, they tend to be able to function fairly well. Individuals with chronic symptoms are going to have sort of longer term persistent symptoms. And these symptoms will develop gradually. So it's not sudden onset, it's gradual onset. And because of this slow onset, they tend to stick around for quite a bit longer, and the prognosis overall is generally fairly poor. So it seems almost counterintuitive that the more sudden and extreme symptoms are actually easier to treat, and the slower, long-lasting symptoms are a lot harder to treat. And then if we wanted to look at when individuals are affected, on the next slide, I'm going to show us a graph that shows age of onset. But I also want to mention that on a graph like that, you would typically separate out men and women, or whatever different demographics you're interested in. But with schizophrenia, it affects men and women pretty much equally. And there's even no difference between people in urban versus rural areas. So like I said before, there's not a lot of distinction between different categories for schizophrenia. We do see that men will typically show their first symptoms in their teens or 20s, and then women will have the onset about a decade later, but that's the only real sex difference that they can agree on in the literature. And so as promised, this is what the graph looks like. So individuals are typically diagnosed in their 20s. Some are diagnosed a little bit earlier. There's, again, a higher likelihood that the earlier diagnoses are male. And then some are diagnosed later on in life. And the later diagnoses are a little bit more likely to be female, but it's not a massive switch. All right. And so, of course, if we're going to be talking about different disorders, we definitely want to ask about, okay, well, what's driving it? And we've kind of mentioned that there's lots of potential different sources. But we, of course, want to figure out, is it genetically driven? Is this something that's heritable? And so we see that in early family studies, incidence of schizophrenia is going to be a lot higher among relatives of people with schizophrenia than it is in the general population. And so what this means is if you looked at something like pedigree, so if you've done a genetics class, or I guess even intro bio would introduce you to these, where you draw one of those pedigrees and it shows all the individuals who are related to each other, and you can indicate which individuals do or do not have a particular disorder. Usually you'd use it in the chapters when you're looking at, is this a dominant or a recessive trait? Can we track it through the family? But with schizophrenia, it's a lot more complex than that. It's not a single dominant or recessive allele. It's a lot more interactive. But what we can do is if we look at these family trees, we can look for incidence. So how many individuals in that family are diagnosed with schizophrenia? And how does that compare to the general population? And of course, if we start seeing this higher rate of incidence in those who are more closely related to one another, we need to keep in mind some of those limitations that we've discussed in the past when we mentioned some of our twin and adoption studies. So if individuals are raised together, they share not only their genetics, but also their environment. So if you are raised by your family, your biological family, then you're going to share genes and environment. And so any kind of association here could be due to either environmental influences or heredity or some combination of both. So it could be genes, it could be environment, but we don't quite know. So a family study tells us that, yeah, there's a possibility here. We see higher incidence within families than between families, but we need to look deeper. And so that's where our twin and adoption studies come in. And so this is from Yeah, so we're still in our textbook material. So we say that, okay, so concordance, which is the likelihood of two individuals both having this disorder, when we specifically look at twins, we have our two categories of twins, which we've talked about before. Identical twins or monozygotic twins, those are the ones that share 100% of their genetics. And then we have fraternal twins or dizygotic twins, and they share only 50% of their genes. They're just like normal siblings that happen to be born at the same time. And we see 3 times the concordance for identical twins as we do for fraternal twins. So the types of twins that are more closely related genetically also have a greater likelihood of both having that disorder. That starts to give us a little bit more evidence that, yeah, there's probably a genetic component here. And if we do our twin and adoption, and maybe if we can do twin/adoption studies where twins are adopted, which is the ideal situation, we can pull out the fact that heritability is probably around 0.8. So we could simplify that to saying that about 80% of the occurrence of schizophrenia is due to the genes that might be related to it. And so with adoption studies, when we're looking at people adopted into environments where they don't share genetics with individuals, it shows that there's almost no benefit or almost no protection offered from an environmental change. So if you have that genetic predisposition for this disorder, even if you're moved into another environment, even if you're adopted out, you're still at higher risk of developing that disorder than someone who doesn't have that genetic predisposition. And so this is sort of the Coles Notes summary that our textbook gives us, but I wanted to show you some of the studies that actually are used to get these statistics. So these are the ones I was talking about where I'm going to go into a little bit more detail than you actually need. So we're going to start here, and then I'll let you know when we're done with these. But these you don't have to know in excruciating detail. I'm just for your informationing. But when we started, a lot of these early studies were done before we had easy access to things like PCR and gene sequencing. So it was really difficult to do a genetic study, but not impossible. And so they found a really interesting situation where Ireland actually keeps very extensive records of psychiatric treatments. Their hospitals have records that go back to their founding. They keep every single piece of paper, and they were able to use those records to track who had been admitted for different things that related to psychiatric disorders. So how many people were admitted for things related to schizophrenia? How many people had delusions and hallucinations and all of those things? So even if they hadn't been officially diagnosed with schizophrenia, we could kind of fill in the blanks using medical records. And we have a fairly homogeneous population there. There's not a lot of immigration, there's not a lot of emigration. And we have this great record of family trees. So individuals know their entire family tree. And so researchers could go there, sit down and talk to individuals in a family, and then go out and interview every single individual or most individuals within a family. They could create these massive pedigrees tracking different disorders back through those family trees in order to see, okay, is it a lot more likely for families that have sort of one individual with schizophrenia to also have other individuals in that lineage who have schizophrenia as well? And that's where we get that initial idea that, yeah, we do see that this is a familial disorder where it's more likely within families than between families. And so one of the big ones that they did was called the Roscommon Family Study. And again, way more than what you need. But this was extensive. And at the time when they were running this, it was kind of the first of its kind. It's one of the pilots and got started into the field of genetics as related to behaviors and specifically psychological disorders. So their sample was people in Ireland who were born after the 1930s. And they ended up finding almost 300 people who had been treated for schizophrenia, but they were also able to get people who were admitted for things that were schizophrenia adjacent. So things like mood disorders. So they were able to get sort of a spread of different disorders and different symptoms, which allowed them to look at sort of proper schizophrenia diagnoses, but also things that might have been misclassified, or things that might be near to schizophrenia. Because as we said, our diagnostic boxes aren't perfect. They also had a really nice control group. So they got 150 control probands, which is basically they found families that matched their families with schizophrenia to compare against. And they managed to interview 88% of the living relatives within all of these families. That was massive. And this took them years and years and years. And they ended up interviewing almost 2,000 relatives, which is huge. And the people who did the interviews were blinded to what was going on. They didn't know if they were interviewing people with or without the disorder, so they controlled for everything. It was a glorious study in its conception. And so they were able to put together all of these details. They collected a massive sample, something that they had never been able to do for a disorder like this. And they found that someone with a first degree relative of someone with schizophrenia is 13 times more likely to develop schizophrenia than someone without a first degree relative. And what this means is first degree relative would be your parents or your children, sort of one step removed on that family tree. And so they said that family history ended up being a better predictor of this order than anything else that had been measured up to that time. And this got them started. This was the first of 10 other studies that all found similar numbers. So this is what got them really interested in it. And this is why schizophrenia ended up being sort of that pilot for genetic studies. And so just for an interesting thing here, this is one of the graphs that shows that dramatic increase in chances of developing schizophrenia. So the people on the top line are individuals with a first degree relative who has schizophrenia, and the bottom line is our control group. And what we're looking at is, as time goes on, or as people get older, what is their cumulative risk of developing schizophrenia? And so as we get older, because as we saw, people are diagnosed with schizophrenia as they get older, we sort of have that increased risk over time naturally. But the risk for those with a relative with schizophrenia is just massively higher than those who are who don't have a relative with it. And so as a brief reminder of our discussion of adoption studies and our logic behind it, this is completely review, so again, more than you need right now. But the idea was that you would look at individuals that share genes but not environment with their biological relatives. So if you look at an individual, so if we think of a person, and then we would compare them to their biological parents, their first degree relatives, then we would be getting an idea of the effect of genes. But if we look at that individual and compare them to their adoptive parents, we're looking at sharing an environment, but not sharing genes. And so if we can look at the difference between biological versus adoptive parents and how those rates compare to individuals with and without schizophrenia, we can actually pick apart, okay, well, how much of this is driven by environment, and specifically shared environment, and how much of it is driven by genes. And so if you have done psychological studies and looked at sort of non-human animals, this would be called a cross-fostering experiment, which they don't typically do with humans. We call them adoption studies, mostly because they're not set up with the intent of studying these disorders. As I said, we just co-opt existing databases. And they had two different ways that they could set this up. So one of them was looking at sort of case and control mothers. So they focused on mothers who developed schizophrenia or who did not develop schizophrenia. So case being developing schizophrenia, control meaning no schizophrenia. And then they looked at how likely were their children to develop schizophrenia. But they also looked at individuals who were adopted. So this is sort of depending on what are they focusing on. So the first one was saying, okay, the mothers either do or don't have schizophrenia. How does that affect the likelihood of their children developing it? And our second study was saying, okay, so we're looking at adoptees, individuals that were adopted, that either did or did not develop schizophrenia. Let's compare them to their biological parents and their likelihood of having it. And let's compare them to their adoptive parents and their likelihood of having it. So if we look at the first one where we're focusing on the mothers, we get a really nice graph here that says, okay, so the mothers with schizophrenia had a much higher risk of having children with schizophrenia. That's that blue bar there, the much higher bar. And in this entire study, they were looking at 50 different individuals for each group. There were no cases of individuals who didn't have schizophrenia having children who were adopted out developing schizophrenia. So that's a really good indicator that, yeah, there's probably some kind of genetic factor here. But we're going to look at the other option as well. What about the children? What if we focus on the adoptees and compare them to their biological versus their adoptive parents? And for this one, I don't really care about the design setups. The ends are just there to let us know that they didn't do this on a very, very small subset. This is pretty decent for disorder studies. Not ideal, but you know. And so if we look at our first degree biological relatives, so we're saying if we focus on our adopted children, the ones that were diagnosed with schizophrenia in their lifetime had a much higher likelihood of also having their parents have schizophrenia. So their first degree biological relatives, there was about an 8% chance that one of the adoptees with schizophrenia had someone else in their family with it as well. And for our control group, the adoptees who didn't develop schizophrenia, there was only a 0.9% chance that someone in their family, their biological family, had it. And so that's probably the fact that there was one individual with one person in their biological family with schizophrenia. And so that's fine on its own. It's showing us that, yeah, we're seeing this higher likelihood of genetic relatedness. But when it gets really, really interesting is when we compare those adoptees to their adoptive relatives. And so even if an adoptee was themselves diagnosed with schizophrenia, there was no cases of their adoptive family also having schizophrenia. So that's telling us that there is very little environmental effect on developing schizophrenia. That's why our heritability estimates are so high. 0.8 is a massive number. The highest you could have is a 1. So we're at sort of almost all the way to the top. And this is why, because there's almost no effective environment, which is very unexpected. All right, and so this diagram does a nice job of summarizing this. This is back to our textbook information. So stepping back from specific studies and looking at those specific results, we can see that if we look at our risks here, identical twins, we're going to see that. Oh, okay, I was just double checking what the other one was. Okay, so with identical twins, they have 100% genetic relatedness. If one twin has schizophrenia, the other twin has almost a 50% chance of having it as well. If we look at the next one down, they haven't specified genetic relatedness, but it says offspring of 2 patients. So I believe that's looking at if both parents have schizophrenia, you have a very, very high chance of having it yourself. And if we go down to fraternal twins, so 50%, we drop from that almost 50% risk down to only about a 20% risk. So we see this nice steady decline where as you are less genetically related, you're also less likely to both have the disorder. And then if we go down to some unrelated individual in the general population, if you don't share genetics with anyone, then you only have like a 1% chance of both expressing that disorder. So this is showing that it's a big difference in concordance based on genetic relatedness. And these are just multiple ways to come at this idea that there is a genetic factor driving the occurrence of schizophrenia, and there is very little environmental effect. And then this is just another way of showing that. So we were looking at risk of schizophrenia if the between fraternal and identical twins. And this one is fairly interesting. So this one shows the fact that, let's see if I can step back and explain what they're looking at here. So this is saying that we're looking at twins, and the twin of interest is going to have children. And the twin of interest does not have schizophrenia, but their twin, the other one, either does or does not, depending on our y-axis here. So if we look at identical twins, if sort of this twin, the one who's not having children, has schizophrenia, they share 100% of the genetics with this individual. So even if our parent doesn't themselves express schizophrenia, they still have the genes that predispose them to have schizophrenia. And so even if they they themselves don't have it, their children are going to be still high risk for having it if their sibling has it as well. Whereas if we look at our fraternal twins, if the the other twin has it, and then the parent, the interested or the twin of interest, does not have it, because they don't share as much of their genetics, the offspring of the fraternal twin that does not have schizophrenia is less likely to have schizophrenia themselves than the child of a schizophrenic parent. And so this is just another one of those coming at it from a different angle, showing us that there is this genetic component. And we can start seeing it in multiple different directions. And these studies that come from our adoption studies actually match what was found in all of those family studies that I mentioned at the beginning. So this is the same basic idea, but the data is coming from family studies instead of the ones from the textbook that were from adoption studies and twin studies. And this shows almost the exact same thing, but we're starting big at the bottom and small at the top, but same basic setup. Okay, so we're going to come back to our topics and stick with our topics for a little bit. I think I only have one more slide from my other class, and it helps illustrate a point, so it'll be relevant. But when we start trying to figure out, okay, so if we have this massive heritability of schizophrenia, well, there must be genes that contribute to it. And of course, the way that people approach things is, okay, well, find the gene. Find the gene so that we can treat it. Find the gene so that we can remove it or change it or fix it. And so people go hunting for where is the schizophrenia gene. And by this point in this course, you've figured out that it's probably not a single gene. It's very rarely a single gene. We've talked about one situation out of all possible situations, which was Huntington's disease, which is the only case of a single gene. Everything else is going to be the cumulative effects of multiple genes. And each individual gene probably only has a modest or moderate contribution to your risk. So what this is telling us is that schizophrenia is probably a polygenic trait. It's something that involves multiple genes. And this is also backed up by the fact that when we look at those family studies, if you dig into it more deeply, you actually figure out that some families tend to have different combinations of symptoms and other families have completely different combinations. So it's like within a family, they have similar genes that are driving it, but in other families, they have different genes that cause maybe similar things and at least the same disorder or diagnosis, but they might not have the same source. So we're back to that ambiguous causes stage. But the typically agreed upon genes that are related to schizophrenia are usually related to things like neurodevelopment and plasticity of the forebrain. And that kind of makes sense. Our forebrain is where we connect things, where we put stuff together, where we have our higher cognitive processing. And so if we're seeing things like hallucinations or delusions, maybe that's misinterpretation or sort of a miscombination of all that information. We also see genes related to neurotransmission. So when sort of when we're sending signals in the brain and the rest of the body that might be affected. And then there's also some more recent stuff looking at maybe it's related to immune and stress responses, where as individuals are more stressed, their body is going to be sort of more heavily influenced, and that increased response to stress will actually lead them to develop the disorder. So it's almost like you're making you more sensitive to environmental factors, which will cause you to express your underlying genetic factors. And that'll make a little bit more sense when we talk about the vulnerability model on the next slide. But overall, despite the fact that we have this massive heritability, that massive score of sort of genetic driving here, genes probably account for less than 5% of the variability in susceptibility to schizophrenia. So what this means is it's probably not specific genes. We can't point to a specific gene and say this is what's causing schizophrenia to happen. Instead, it's going to be a complex system that involves a lot of different aspects. Again, lots of interactions and lots of uncertainty. And so this brings us to our vulnerability model. This is us trying to simplify and explain what the heck is going on where, okay, so we can have this genetic predisposition, but if we don't have necessarily like environmental effects that are causing things, like what's going on? How is this all fitting together? Because it's either genes or it's environment, right? Why is it not a clearer picture? And so our vulnerability model basically says that there's some threshold of causal forces that have to be exceeded in order for an illness to occur. This is basically saying that you might have a genetic predisposition for a disorder, but unless you encounter a sufficiently high amount of stressors in your life, you won't be pushed over that threshold to develop the disorder itself. And I find that most textbooks really struggle to give a good explanation of this model. And so again, I steal a diagram that I think I actually had borrowed from another textbook to talk about in my other class. But this is looking at specifically the diathesis stress model, which is another name for the vulnerability model. I kept it because the name itself is actually informative. Diathesis is a genetic predisposition, and stress is your environmental influence. And so the idea here, this one is set up to look at alcoholism, but the visual really, really worked for me. And so this is saying that, okay, so we have a diathesis, a genetic vulnerability. And that's that sort of liquid at the bottom, the darker colored liquid. So when we look at person number 1, they have a much higher diathesis. They have more of a vulnerability than person number 2. They have sort of very different predispositions. So that would be saying like person 1 has someone in their family, an immediate relative who has schizophrenia. They have a large genetic vulnerability. But person number 2, they don't have someone in their immediate family. Maybe they have someone 3 generations back who had schizophrenia-like symptoms, but not enough to be sort of a high risk. So they have different existing diatheses. Okay, so what about the environmental component? So maybe they both get exposed to the same kind of stresses. For things like alcoholism, this would be exposure to drinking. Maybe you grew up in a college town and there's lots of binge drinking, or maybe your family drank a lot. That would be high stress exposure that would predispose you to develop alcoholism. With schizophrenia, it's a lot less clear cut as to what these stressors might be, but we could just say general life stresses. So maybe your life is difficult. Maybe you lose your job, maybe you suffer loss. Those things would be generally stressful. And so the individual number 1 and individual number 2 in this situation get the same amount of life stress. But because individual 1 already had that genetic predisposition, that addition of environmental stressors was enough to push them over the threshold to develop the disorder. Whereas individual number 2, they weren't pushed across that threshold. because they didn't have that predisposition, they did have a lot of risk added by their environment, but they never met the threshold for symptoms to actually develop. And so the idea here would be an individual who has a genetic predisposition, if they have very few environmental stressors, they may never display that disorder. That's why we can have identical twins where one twin has it and the other doesn't. If they have different life experiences, maybe one was more stressed in their lives and the other was not. But it also tells us that individuals with a lesser risk, if they're exposed to enough stress in their environment, they might cross that threshold. And in the opening paragraph of our textbook, they actually talk about an individual who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I'm not sure if it was his delusion or if it was a real thing, but he was convinced that he had been slipped a dose of LSD, and that's what precipitated his crossing over into schizophrenia. And that's not impossible. Exposure to different kinds of drugs and different situations can lead to sort of crossing that threshold. But it would only have been able to occur if they had sufficient existing vulnerability and probably already existing levels of stress. And so I find this diagram does a much better job of anything else that I've seen to explain this model. It makes it just that little bit more intuitive, talking about the two interacting. All right, so next I wanted to talk about our two types of schizophrenia symptoms. And so we can have positive versus negative symptoms. And so as I said before, we used to divide schizophrenia up into different categories, and some were sort of more typical of positive symptoms and some were more typical of negative symptoms. Now we don't really do that breakdown. We will specify if someone has positive versus negative symptoms, but it isn't necessarily part of a sub-categorization. So for our positive symptoms, we're typically looking at things that are exaggerations or overproductions of behaviors. So this is going to be the presence of exaggerated behaviors like delusions, hallucinations, disordered thinking, and even abnormal motor behaviors, so movement disorders. Those would all be positive symptoms because now there is too much of something. So too much thinking, too much seeing of things or hearing of things, thoughts in disorder and things like that. Whereas our negative symptoms, these are all going to be kind of the lack or absence of normal behaviors. So insufficient behavior. And you'll find that most of these start with A because it's lacking that thing. So we can have apathy, which is a lack of initiative. We can have lack of speech. We can have lack of enjoyment. Affective flattening basically is talking about when they don't have normal emotions to express. And also asociality. So we talked about people withdrawing from their social circles. These would all be sort of lacks of normal behaviors. So they'd fall under that negative symptoms category. And so our positive symptoms tend to be more acute, which we now know means that they have a better prognosis, and they tend to respond better to antipsychotic drugs. Negative symptoms are typically more likely to be chronic, and therefore have a poorer prognosis and don't respond to treatment as well. And then again, we have our nice summary of positive versus negative schizophrenia symptoms. So this is just a nice way to sort of put that together. And so, okay, that's our basic setup. That's some of the symptoms. That's how we get to some of these numbers. What do they think is actually driving this? Like if we can't point to a specific gene, can we at least point to a mechanism? Is there something that might be going on? And the answer is yes and no. We have some theories, and none of them completely explain all categories or all types of schizophrenia. So the biggest one is the dopamine hypothesis. And this is the theory that schizophrenia would involve high and sort of overactive dopamine activity. So having too much dopamine functioning in the body. And so they're saying that, okay, so these heightened levels of dopamine are going to increase our attentional and motivational circuits. and it's going to make different things in our environment seem significant. So it's basically going to start overriding our natural perception of the world. So that's where things like paranoia and delusions could come from, because all of a sudden things that weren't significant are now very important to our adjusted mental states. So this is called the aberrant salience hypothesis, basically saying that some things are made more salient simply by affecting those pathways. And I don't believe the textbook goes into this, but this idea of sort of dopamine being involved was actually a sort of side effect of something else. They were trying to treat something else with sort of, I think, reducing dopamine levels. And it ended up helping individuals with schizophrenia. I can't remember what the original disorder was, but it was one of those things where they were trying to fix something else. And as a happy accident, it helped with schizophrenia. And that's where this hypothesis came from, was actually accidental discovery, which is kind of interesting. All right, and so the dopamine hypothesis is great and all, but it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't explain the whole picture. So we run into this issue where these dopaminergic, or drugs that sort of reduce those excessive dopamine levels, don't actually work for a large portion of the population. So about 30 to 40% of patients with schizophrenia don't respond to adjusted dopamine levels, which tells us that if dopamine is sort of driving the other 70 or 60 to 70%, maybe there's a different mechanism for these remaining ones. Perhaps. Again, we're not quite sure. It also gets more complicated because we have something called tardive dyskinesia. And this is basically when individuals take dopamine blockers for long periods of time. So the normal treatment for schizophrenia, at some point, an individual might develop this disorder, which has tremors and involuntary movements. So basically at some point, and at some random point, we can't really predict when it's going to happen, their body stops responding the way that it has been, and all of a sudden everything gets out of whack. And so the idea is that maybe it's affecting the sensitivity of those dopamine receptors. Maybe it's, well, and I guess in the long term, it ends up causing neuron death. So if you see individuals who have taken these dopamine blockers for long periods of time, they actually have degradation in different areas of the brain, especially those that would usually be high in dopamine. And so it can cause problems, especially in our basal ganglia, hence the movement problems. But this is one of those things that kind of pops up suddenly and can be very detrimental. It can cause a lot of problems. And so because of that issue with those standard dopamine blocking agents, they've sort of developed different approaches. So these are called neuroleptics, and these are atypical or second generation antipsychotics. And they're going to block the receptors less strongly and are going to be targeting other non-dopamine receptors as well. So it's kind of like saying, okay, so if we block all of the dopamine receptors, we create problems. So what if we spread out a little bit? What if we are less intensive and more general in our blocking? And so those seem to be almost equivalently effective, but also less likely to cause long-term damage like movement disorders. We also have the glutamate theory, and this basically says that we can have hypo is under functioning of NMDA receptors, which would lead to an increase in glutamate, and an increase in glutamate will then precipitate an increase in dopamine. So this isn't so much an alternative theory, but sort of setting up that dopamine hypothesis. And if we see these variations in our NMDA receptors, so for example, if we have a gene that produces some component of these receptors that has an allele that's non-functional, we actually are more likely to see both positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia, which tells us that that might be the pathway that's involved, at least sometimes. And if you look at the research, and even in our textbook, they go into a lot more detail about the specific pathways and the specific genes that are involved. I care a lot less about those. All right. And so I mentioned the fact that we can have neurological anomalies. Specifically, we were talking about anomalies that come from the treatments, but there are also neurological anomalies that come from the disorder itself. Or I guess come from is implying causality. It might be that the disorder leads to the degradation, or maybe the degradation leads to the disorder. We're not quite sure here. But again, we run into that issue with schizophrenia as a diagnosis where we can have malfunctions in pretty much every part of the brain. It's not just where we would expect to see it. We can have sort of odd activity, and again, over and under activity in different parts of the brain that can all lead to both positive and negative symptoms. So this is a lot more complicated than maybe we would want in studying a disease. We do typically see brain tissue deficits, so sort of less brain tissue than there should be. And going along with that, we have ventricular enlargement. So if you remember, our ventricles are sort of those fluid channels that run through the inside of our brain. And so what happens is that those channels are getting larger, and therefore there's less volume left for the brain to exist. And so if I hop to this next slide here, you can actually see that's pointed out our ventricles, sort of these red, let me see if I can scoot this over. There we go. Our red splotches in the middle. And our individuals with schizophrenia have much larger ventricles than those without. And they've even done a, what do they call it? Ventricle to brain ratio. So they've controlled for amount of brain mass. And the patients with schizophrenia have a significantly higher sort of ventricle volume versus their brain mass. So that's pretty interesting. We also have what's called hypofrontality. And so again, hypo meaning an underactivation, and frontality referring to our sort of frontal lobe. And so this is basically saying that we have less involvement in that frontal lobe in individuals with schizophrenia. And so usually something like this would be evaluated using what's called a Wisconsin card sorting test. And they always have strange names for these kinds of psychological studies. But it's a measure that requires an individual to change strategies in the middle of doing a task. So first you would sort cards using one particular criterion, and then you would change in the middle to use something else. It's kind of like, have you ever done one of those things where they have a list of words on a slide, and the words start off where the color of the word matches the word itself, and then eventually the color of the word is different than the word itself. And so sometimes you have to say the color, and sometimes you have to say the word. A Wisconsin card sorting test would be like, okay, you do half the test focusing on the color, and the other half the word. And so they'd be looking at sort of your prefrontal cortex being active and helping you switch those contingencies. And individuals without schizophrenia are able to do that task reasonably well. But we see a lot less activity and a lot more errors in individuals with schizophrenia. So individuals with schizophrenia perform poorly on that kind of a test, and they persist with the earlier sorting strategy. So they have less of an ability to switch mid-task. And so the idea here is that maybe it's disrupted communication between our hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, or maybe it's a local dopamine deficiency in the prefrontal cortex. You can tell from the variability in the proposed theories that they really don't know. And then if we wanted to look at sort of the areas, this is just showing the blood flow in those areas. And so we can have sort of high versus low activation in individuals without schizophrenia. So our control individuals have higher activation in the frontal lobe, and individuals with schizophrenia are going to have lower activation in those areas. All right. So for other anomalies that we encounter, there are things to do with neural connections and synchrony. Basically, are they able to fire together in a predictable way? And so instead of, I guess this is sort of a shift in theories lately. So it was originally focused on, okay, what what exact spot in the brain is responsible for schizophrenia. And then we realize, okay, it's pretty widespread. There's no exact spot. And then they've started looking at other things. So instead of looking at just these localized deficits, they're now starting to look at coordination in activity across the brain. So typically, especially with our sort of outer cortex, that's where we store a lot of things. That's where a lot of things like our primary motor cortex is and our primary sensory cortex is. So we're going to have all of these things sort of on the surface, and a lot of that information moves around. Like as we talked about, where we have sensations leading to movements and back again, we have this feedback. But if the communication between different areas in the brain is disrupted, if we have asynchrony where things can't connect, then we're going to start seeing some problems. So the idea here is that schizophrenia might lead to abnormal connections in neural activity across those different brain areas. And so when we look at, again, sort of working memory tasks, so using the surface of our brain, holding on to information, if you remember back to studying memory, probably in intro psych, a lot of our working memory is going to be sort of loosely storing information in that outer cortex. And when doing a working memory task, individuals in a control group, so individuals without schizophrenia, have pretty decent sort of transfer between the hippocampus and that cortex and back again with no big issues. But that coordination is pretty much absent in individuals with schizophrenia. And so we start seeing a reduction in white matter, the stuff that's mostly in our cortex. And that helps, or that ends up compromising the quality of those connections. So if you remember back to our discussion about neurons, neurons sometimes have that myelin sheath, and myelin is a white fatty substance that helps speed up those action potentials. That white fatty substance is what makes white matter white. So if we're lacking white matter, we're basically lacking myelination on some of our neurons. Yep.
You might not know the answer to this, but is there any type of, I guess, comorbidity between people with MS and people with schizophrenia?
Ooh, interesting. I don't know. My gut response is probably not, because in MS, the degradation of those neurons is almost exclusively motor related. At least that's my gut response. I don't actually know, and it'd be kind of interesting to check. But yeah, I think it's more that this would be hear issues, and then MS is like motor tract issues, but potentially. But yeah, so we're losing that white matter, that sort of extra connectivity, that extra speed. And so maybe we're losing neurons, or maybe we're just losing that protection. And uninsulated neurons are going to have slower transmission rates, and they're also going to be a lot more likely to drop a signal because it might not be able to jump. Because as we said before, there's no gates under our myelin sheath. So if the myelin goes away, there aren't actually those protein gates to allow an action potential to occur. So if we start sort of bleeding stuff out of the neuron, that signal might not make it all the way to the end. So there's lots of things that could be going on there. And so we can actually look at, I think I have, yes, I do. Okay, so this is looking at something that's called a P50 response. And this is basically the fact that, let me see if I can see it. Okay. Okay, so this is basically showing that if we have these follow-up signals in a control brain, so someone without schizophrenia, the first signal will fire as per normal, and we'll see activation in a particular area. But then when that is no longer needed, if we need to inhibit brain activity in that area, we can. So that's our second signal. So we can see that there's a lack of response afterwards. But in an individual with schizophrenia, they are unable to do that dampening. They're unable to sort of inhibit responses in certain areas. So we're not having the same kind of neural response. So we don't have this P50 gating or this sort of inhibited responding in different brain areas. And so we could spend so much time on that, but I'm not going to go too much into that. I guess we'll skim through some of this. Okay. There we go. Interesting. I will mention that before I move on. I had put a bunch of stuff in the notes just in case I had time to chat about them. But so we mentioned that hallucinations are a big component of some individuals' experience with schizophrenia. And if we actually look at brain scans of individuals with schizophrenia while they're hallucinating, they have the language area of their brain ends up being active while they have auditory hallucinations, and the occipital region, so our visual cortex, is going to be active during visual hallucinations. So it's actually that the brain thinks it's seeing something, it's interpreting stimulus there. So it's interesting to know that it's not just the interpretation, it's just not the connection. There's also something being expressed in those areas. And again, it's not overly well understood. And so the idea here is that that activation overlaps really, really intensively with our inner dialogue. So there was this, the viral discussion that went around not too long ago about some people have an inner dialogue and some people don't. Those who do have an inner dialogue, if they sort of can narrate and discuss with themselves in their own heads, that's going to activate the same part of the language center the way that those auditory hallucinations would. And sort of our internal imagining of sort of visual scenes, things that we remember, part of our active memory, would activate the visual center the same way. And so one of the predominant theories about those activations in individuals experiencing hallucinations, it's that they're misinterpreting their own inner dialogue as those hallucinations. So they can't connect their own influence on those things occurring, and so they perceive it as something external. So that might just be an inability to communicate on what's causing it and therefore being able to take ownership of it, or maybe something a little bit more complex. All right. And then there's a bunch of stuff, like I said, they don't have tons of environmental influences. Most of the studies that we've looked at have showed that it's mostly genetic. There's not a ton of environmental influences. But we do see a couple of, maybe there's some environmental origins of some of the brain and neurotransmitter anomalies. So there might be something related to our environment. But there's a lot of contention about the setups for that. Let me just see what I wanted to say about our winter birth effect. Oh, and this is just another weird thing that they don't know quite how to explain, but individuals who develop schizophrenia are more likely to be born during winter and spring than any other time of year. And it's a significant difference, like it's an actual large difference, and it's consistent across multiple countries, and they don't quite know why. So that might be an environmental factor, perhaps. But I think we are out of time, so we are going to leave it there for today. We only have just oh yeah, that was it. That was pretty much it. I have one more chart that we'll go over at the start of next class, but otherwise we're good. So we will call it there, and then we'll finish up that and move on to our affective disorders for next class.